right, so let's go ahead and get started. So thank you everyone for joining and welcome to the webinar, Keeping Your Sandbox in Sync with Production. Just a quick introduction for myself. My name is Scott Dixon. I am a customer engineer here at Salto. I'm located in New York and I help our customers onboard and implement Salto, as well as during the pre-sales process, making sure that Salto is going to be a good technical fit for the organization. Now, before we get started with the webinar, I just wanted to kind of give a few housekeeping rules, or not necessarily rules, but just kind of guidance. So we've got a chat on the Zoom chat, so please feel free to ask any questions. We might share a few links to like our documentation, so keep an eye on the chat. There's also a Q&A in the Zoom chat. So if you have a specific question that you would like answered during the webinar, please enter it there. If we need to answer it after the webinar, maybe to provide a little bit more details, your name will be attached there, so we can always follow up from there. And then after the webinar, we will send everyone a recording, as well as some helpful links to any references, documentation, blog links, and so on that we bring up during the webinar. And just to set some expectations about timing, we're not expected to kind of last the full 60 minutes. That being said, we have this whole hour kind of saved for this webinar. So if you have any questions, we will make sure those get answered near the end. But if we don't have too many answers, the webinar might be a little bit closer to 30, 45 minutes. All right, so let's get started. So just a little bit of background about Salto before we get started. So Salto is a platform to help you manage your SaaS applications. The reason that we built Salto was because today SaaS applications are really running the modern company. You can see here from all these logos, your organization likely has a number of these different tools supporting your organization: Salesforce, NetSuite, tools like, obviously we're talking about Jira here today, but a lot of these different tools, and they require a deep level of customization to make sure that they are going to work for your organization. Now, to actually configure a lot of these tools, there's a lot of no or low code ways that you can manage these, like for example, using drop downs or setting up configurations manually through the UI. And this is pretty common across most of these SaaS applications. And this can come with some unique challenges of their own. When you're managing a deeply customized application that doesn't necessarily have a great way to manage those changes, that can create some complexity. So here at Salto, we've applied some of the best practices and tools from DevOps principles into how business and IT applications are managed. So before we get started with the demo, where we kind of go into some of the details about how Salto is going to help you keep your environments aligned, I'd like to start with a poll just to get an idea from the audience. So I'm going to start the poll in just a second. So the poll is a little bit about kind of your usage of Jira and Jira Sandboxes so far, how you deal with documentation, how aligned your Sandbox is to your production environment. If you wouldn't mind taking a look at the poll and answering, and I'll share some of the results at the end. All right, so let's go right into Salto. Just one second here while I switch my screen. All right, so like I mentioned, Salto is a SaaS platform to manage other SaaS applications like Jira, Salesforce, NetSuite, Zendesk, and so on. Today, we're going to talk specifically about how Salto helps you manage your Jira environments. And more specifically, I want to chat about how Salto can help you keep your sandbox in line with Jira. So I'm looking at some of the stats just to share. One of the first questions was, do you use a Jira sandbox? And it looks like the majority of you are using. However, we do have a few people that are not using a Jira Sandbox today. So for anyone who's not familiar with a Jira Sandbox is a test or development environment that should be a mirror of your production environment. And you can use it in Jira to create and edit any customizations. before making those changes live to your production environment where your users could be affected. Now, that comes with challenges of its own, as it's not necessarily so straightforward to move configurations between a sandbox and a production environment. And as we see a lot of times, users make changes, or admins are making changes directly to a production environment. And then that makes your sandbox environment not so aligned with production, which then kind of leads to its own problems where your sandbox environment is no longer a mere copy of production. So how can Salto help with this? So the way that Salto works is that when you connect and authenticate Salto to your Jira environment, so that's both your sandbox and your production environment, Salto runs a fetch to pull down all the configuration metadata. Now, this is just the configuration metadata. So not talking about the data coming from like issues or the comments on those issues or any of the users, but more like the automations, the workflows, any of the schemas, the project configurations, and so on. Once Salto runs a fetch on that environment, you are going to see everything from your environment in terms of the configuration metadata listed here on the left-hand side. Now, just a quick note, Salto does support both Jira software projects and JSM projects. Now, those come with their own configurations. So, for example, for software projects, we can also pull in the boards. For JSM projects, we can also pull in things like queues, request types, forms, and so on. All of those are going to be listed here on the left-hand side under the Explore. And then you can use this to explore what you've already got set up. So for example, let me go down to one of my workflows that I've got set up. So in my environment, I've got this workflow around updating a team. And when I pull this up in my Salto environment, I can of course see how that workflow is set up. And then some of the more interesting parts is going to be down here at the bottom. This is where Salto will show you any of its dependencies. So in this case, I can see that this workflow calls out to a couple of statuses as well as the screen. I can also click into this status. I can also click into that screen as well. And I can see how it's set up. And then at the bottom, I can see where it's being referenced. Now, this is very, very helpful in case you need to kind of understand the impact of a potential change. So let's say that I were to, maybe I had a change request that came in that said I need to change something about this status. I could come into Salto, I can see where that status is being referenced. So that way I understand, do I need to remap the status? Do I need to make any other changes? Making sure I kind of limit the impact of making that change. Now, in terms of trying to make sure that you got your environments aligned, Salto has a feature to be able to compare environments between each other under our compare and deploy section right here. So let's run a comparison between my sandbox and my production environment. So how you can do that is you would set your source environment, in other words, where you've developed most of your configurations, and then the target environment. So this kind of represents the environment that you want to push those configurations to. And I'm going to give this a title. So I'll just go ahead and call this first comparison, because right now I'm using this as more of a way to understand the differences between my environments. So Salto's, as soon as you create a comparison, Salto is going to instantly show you all of the changes or the differences between those environments. And this is only going to be those differences. So if you've got a project that is completely aligned between environments, Salto won't display that here. This is just focus on all of the differences. Now, just to kind of break it down, what it's showing you here, think of this view as showing if I want my target environment, in this case, my production environment, to mirror my sandbox environment or my source environment, this is the number of changes it would take to get those environments aligned. So it would take this many additions of net new configurations that exist only in my sandbox environment. It would require this many modifications, and it would require this many deletions. So what that means, what we mean there is that if you want production to mirror sandbox, it looks like there's a number of configurations that are actually in production. So in other words, if we want to mirror sandbox, it would require removing them. Now, what we notice is that if you start to see a lot of configuration show up in this deletions tab, basically this is saying that it looks like there's a lot of configurations being added directly to production without being added to Sandbox first. Now, before we go into making any changes here, I did want to note that with Salto, you're able to actually export all of these as a CSV file. And this export respects the kind of filters that you have already put on it. So for example, if I go straight to the deletions tab and I export this to a CSV, I'll get a list of every single element that exists only in my production environment, not in my Sandbox environment. So I can use that for some additional analysis. Maybe I need to start planning how am I going to get Sandbox back in line with production. I saw a question pop up, so let me get that. Let me take a look. If we eventually subscribe to Enterprise JSM, does having a lower development environment in different organizations impact how Salto will work rather than using a Sandbox in the same organization? So great question, AJ. So if you have an environment, a lower environment that's in a different organization, there's no limitation from a Salto perspective. So you can connect that lower environment to Salto. You can still run a comparison between those two environments, and you can still deploy between those environments. So there's no restriction at all. Salto can still deploy between organizations as well as between environments within the same organization. We actually have some of our customers are using Salto to manage kind of core templates across a variety of production environments that their organization supports. And so they have one production site that holds all of the templates for their projects, and then they push those out using Salto to their various production environments. So again, no restriction. Salto can support deploying between any two environments, whether those environments exist in the same organization or exist across multiple organizations. Now, I'm looking at this comparison here, and I'm noticing quite a few differences. Now, obviously, in this Additions tab, this is showing me things that exist only in my Sandbox environment. So I could use this to deploy some of those changes right up to production. But what I want to do here is actually take a look at this Deletions tab, because it looks like there's a number of things that have been added to production that were never added to Sandbox in the first place. So you can also use Salto to deploy from a production environment back down to those lower environments to keep those environments aligned without having to do a whole Sandbox refresh. And if you're not familiar with the Sandbox refresh, what I mean by that is creating a new Sandbox or kind of doing a new data copy in Jira to get your Sandbox in line with production, which is great, but you do run the risk of getting everything in that Sandbox kind of wiped, so you can have a new copy of everything that's in production. So Salto works really great with that process, because you can come into Salto, you can run a comparison between your Sandbox and production environment, understand what is sitting there in that Sandbox environment that would be potentially wiped from doing a Sandbox refresh, as well as understand anything that's sitting there in my production environment that hasn't been moved down to my Sandbox environment. I saw one more question from Denise. Can Salto do the same for add-on configurations in the environments? So Denise, today the only add-on that we really support is Script Runner. We're planning on adding support for more plugins. However, Script Runner was the first one that we added support for. So if you have any post functions or scripts and listeners coming from Script Runner, Salto can also fetch those and deploy those between environments as well. Now, coming back to my comparison here, if I come into the deletions, I can actually see there's a number of changes to a project. In fact, it looks like I have an entire project that was added in production that was not added to my Sandbox environment, as well as I have a number of automations that exist only in my production environment. So what I'd like to do here is show you how I could deploy those specific changes that were made in that production environment back down to my Sandbox environment to keep my Sandbox aligned. Now, this comparison right here is going from Sandbox to production. So I'm wanting to do the opposite. So let's go ahead and create a new one in Salto. So I'm going to create one where I have the source is coming from production, and my target is going to be my Sandbox environment. And I'm going to call this sync Sandbox, and click on compare and deploy. And now I have pretty much the same set of information, only it's showing me from the opposite direction. In other words, what do I need to move to Sandbox to keep it in line with production? So here in that Additions tab, I can see that I've got to add this specific project. And now with Salto, what I would do is I would come in, I would add this specific project, and under the additional dependencies, it's going to show me any specific changes that have been made. So in this case, I can see that the notification scheme that's associated with this project also needs to be added. And I can also see that there are some issue layouts and a specific automation that would also need to be added. So let me go ahead and add all of these. Now, during the deployment process, Salto is going to automatically check for dependencies. In other words, any fields, schemes, or anything that's being used by any of the elements that you selected, checking to make sure that they also exist in the target environment. And if they don't, they're going to be flagged as a missing dependency. So sure enough, it looks like I've got a couple of those missing dependencies here. So if I take a look at them, it looks like here we've got a field that's being referenced by one of my screens. So I need to go ahead and add that to my deployment. Now, as soon as I add this particular field, it looks like I also need to add the context. I also need to add this specific group. So this is a pretty common practice if you're moving a configuration over. You might have a number of dependencies that you don't realize that you've also built that aren't aligned between the environments. So Salto will flag those and make sure that you get those moved over. So Brian, I saw a question in the chat here. If I have a post function using an add-on JSU, for example, will that transfer? So Brian, great question. So right now for post functions, if you we don't support JSU yet. However, if it is a post function coming from script runner, that is something that we can support. All right, so now I've got to get my Sandbox aligned with production. I'm going to make a couple of changes. I'm going to add one of these projects and all of its dependencies, and then I also want to actually add. I already added that automation. So it's not everything, but it will get my environment much more aligned with my Sandbox environment, much more aligned with production. So let me go ahead and move to the next step here. In the deployment preview step, what Salto is doing is it's basically running validation across the elements that have been selected, and Salto will raise any potential issues with the things that you've selected. So there's a few edge cases where you might need some manual intervention. So for example, if you have an automation or something that is being something has some sensitive information like credentials, Salto does not fetch anything like that, and so those will be masked, and you will need to update those credentials when you deploy into the target environment. All right, so I've got my deployment plan has run, and it looks like everything is good to go. If there were any problems, this is where they would be raised, but I can go ahead and get those deployed. So let me go ahead and deploy those changes. Now, while this deployment is running, let me share a few results from the poll so far. So for the first question, asking, who all is using a Sandbox in Jira? So actually, the majority of you are using it, and then we just have about 10% of you all are not using a Jira Sandbox. But the majority of you are using it now to different degrees. And then in terms of how aligned the Sandbox is with production, it looks like for about 73% of you, it looks like there are some discrepancies, but they're somewhat aligned. 18% of you said not aligned at all. And then obviously there's about 10% of you not using a Sandbox. All right, so I got a couple questions want to take a look at. So AJ had the question: if a business has been trying to keep the environments the same, but unique IDs are truly unique between environments, how does Knuckles, which is our mascot, by the way, our mascot here at Salto, the little beaver that you see, how does Knuckles know how to correlate between environments and know whether or not exist in other environments? And does that translation differ between JSM and assets? So great question, AJ. So at a really high level, the way that Salto is aligning these elements, let's use a field, for example. Basically, Salto is taking a look at the name of the field. Now, there's a little bit more that Salto is doing, but just for simplicity's sake, Salto is looking at the name of the field. And if the name matches across the environment, which most of the time they will, Salto is able to kind of create a linkage behind the scenes, and then we can compare. So if you make any changes or if you have any references to that field, Salto knows that custom field 123 in your Sandbox environment is actually the same as custom field 456. Now, this also works. Let's say that you push out a new automation, you push out a new workflow that refers to a new field that needs to be created. Salto will create that new field first, and then update the automation or the workflow to refer to the newly created custom field by its ID. So at a really high level, Salto is managing behind the scenes, knowing that these elements are the same across the environments, and then updating those IDs when necessary for you. And then you asked, does the translation differ between JSM and assets? So no, it's primarily the same. I will say Salto doesn't manage the assets directly. However, Salto can manage the asset schemes themselves. All right, so I've got the deployment was done. Looks like I had a couple issues, so I can probably take a look at those later by clicking on fixing deployment and moving to deploying those changes. But a couple of things I wanted to point out about this deployment is that when you do deployments with Salto, under the deployments history, you'll be able to see a history of all of the changes that were deployed for a particular environment. Now, this is really helpful to be able to document all of those changes that are happening to the environment. And then on top of getting the deployments automatically documented with Salto, we can also connect up to a Git repo for much more granular details of the exact changes that were made. So if anyone is familiar with Git, Git is a version control system typically used for software developers. We're able to leverage it in Salto because during the fetch process, we're essentially turning all those configurations into a flat file structure. So it allows Salto to manage all of the configurations as if they were code. So with that in mind, let me go ahead and take a look exactly what we pushed up here. Now I'm showing an example for GitHub, but Salto supports any of the major Git providers, GitLab, Bitbucket, and so on. And Salto is going to push up exactly what was changed as part of this deployment. And here we can see very, very detailed information. Now, I should note, if you're not familiar with Git or not super familiar with these files, not a big deal at all. Salto automatically pushes these up for you, so you don't need to manage any of these changes yourself. Now, I wanted to jump, I saw a couple of questions. I actually want to jump to Darlene's question, can Salto account for multiple Jira sandboxes? So Darlene, the answer here is yes. And actually, so I don't have a great example because I've only got one sandbox, but imagine if I had multiple sandboxes or multiple Jira environments that I was using as a sandbox. So the reason I say that is I have a couple customers that they are using a completely separate production site, almost as if it was a sandbox environment, and then using Salto to actually deploy those changes. So developing changes to a project, to a scheme, to a workflow, and then pushing that change over to the next environment. If you're leveraging something like that, if I come to the history tab, it's a little bit more obvious, but what you can do here is as you make changes to that first lower environment, you can select changes that were made to that first lower environment, select promote, and then promote those changes up to the next higher environment. So that allows you to operate Salto in ways that is more akin to like a software development lifecycle process, where you are making changes in a developer environment, moving those up to a test environment, moving those up to a staging or pre-prod environment, and then ultimately deploying those out to production. So this promote capability works for not only a single deployment, but you can select multiple past deployments to promote into. And just coming back to the compare and deploy, there was another question. It was very quick to get from Bernard. It was very quick to get the comparison listed compared to the deployment of the changes. Do you pull state config of the system regularly to allow the comparison faster? Yeah, great question. So yes, so the kind of the polling is what we call fetch. The fetch is the operation to pull in the latest sets of configuration metadata. And that fetch is typically run on a schedule. It can be run as many times as hourly. It can also, by default, it runs daily, and you can also run it weekly. In addition, you can run it at any time. We will actually prompt you when you start a deployment. If I click on the compare and deploy again. So let's say that I was going to deploy a change from my sandbox to my production environment. If you can see here, I can click on fetch now. So during the deployment process, we'll run an additional fetch to make sure that we pull in all the latest configuration changes. Now, when you run the comparison, Salto is comparing all of the changes that we see from the latest fetch results. But if you are running a fetch and you have some new results, let's say that, for example, I don't know, maybe one of my colleagues just made a change, they had a new field. and I ran a fetch, Salto will pull that in as part of the fetch, and then also update your deployment plan. So not your past deployments, but your deployment plan, just to make sure you're taking into account any recent changes that have taken place. Now, another question, can we sync to Bitbucket on-prem? Yes, I should mention we do support Bitbucket on-prem as well as the other on-prem Git providers. As long as it's Git, not going to be a problem. All right, so I'm in my compare and deploy. So I've just done a deployment from my production back to my Sandbox environment to keep those environments aligned. So this is going to be the best way to actually keep those environments aligned. But what about for those ongoing changes? So obviously, you can't necessarily come into Salto every single time and check the comparison to see, have anyone deployed changes to my workflows? Has anyone added new fields and so on? So what we would recommend to do in that case is use our monitors feature. So our monitoring feature is going to help you keep notified of all those changes happening directly in your production environment. The way that they work is if I come down to the monitors changes, you're able to create notifications for specific changes. Now, I could also create this for all the changes that are happening in my my Jira environment. Actually, let me go down to when down here for automation or workflow removed. So you can set this up for one or multiple types. So I can say, if any configuration is updated or just my automation or workflows are updated, send me an email. This can also be sent to multiple emails, to a Slack channel, to a Teams channel. And then really importantly, you can filter this to either, give me a notification when this change is made directly in the environment, or give me a notification if this is made via Salto as well. The reason that we split this out is because if you're doing deployments through Salto, this is going to be automatically documented. But for those changes that are happening directly in the Jira system, you may not know about those. So this way, if you set these notifications up, you'll get an email kind of like this. And again, this can be sent out to Slack or to Teams. And it will say exactly what was modified, what was removed, what was added, and then the detailed change report will be sent out here, containing very, very specific information about what exactly was changed. Now, this works really nicely with our version control. Think of this as almost like a change log to document all the changes that are happening to a particular environment. So if I come back to my version control tab here, this is going to show all the changes that are being pushed via Salto to my production environment. And then additionally, it's also going to show any changes that are being manually documented, or likely because they're coming from changes that are happening directly in the environment. So if I click preview push here, what this is showing me is these are all of the changes that Salto has detected that are not part of a Salto deployment, that have not been pushed up to Git yet. That's why they're showing it as like an unpushed file. In other words, there's been a file that's been updated, added, deleted, but it's not being tracked currently in your Git repository that you've connected to. So what you can do is you can come in through Salto, you can select, let's say, for example, I see that this automation was recently added. I can go ahead and add a specific message like, hey, this is actually related to Scott's changes, or a specific request, change request. I can click push, get those changes pushed up to my Git repo, and now my version control tab is going to show that change as soon as that gets pushed up. We can see that right here. And this way you get really full visibility and full documentation to all those changes that are being made. Now, coming back to the poll from earlier, wanted to share some of those results. So for those of you that are asking, how do you document changes made to production? So 64% of you said that you're using Jira tickets or another ticket management platform, which is great. Great that you're tracking those changes. 36% says the Confluence or another collaborative documentation platform, which is also great. Great that you're keeping track of those changes. And then about 27% of you said that you don't, or you rely on the audit logs. So especially for those of you that are not doing any sort of documentation or relying on the audit logs, this version control tab in Salto would really help getting kind of an understanding of not only the changes that that you're making because you're making them through a Salto deployment, but you're going to keep track of changes that are happening directly in the system as well. And then one other thing that I wanted to share is around another kind of use case for setting up monitors in Salto. So here specifically, I have one about an automation or workflow being removed. So I also you can set up multiple notifications in Salto. And I asked, and it's related to the fourth questions that I asked during the poll. So have you or a colleague ever deleted a configuration in production? So 60% of you said yes. So for the 60% of you, and actually also for the 40% of you that said not yet, I'd recommend taking a look at this feature because it can save you a lot of grief, a lot of time trying to revert any unintended changes. So for example, let's say that I've got this monitor set up on any time that a workflow or automation is removed directly in Jira, it's going to send me an email notification saying which are the workflows that were removed. Now, let's say I get that, I can come back to Salto. One of the deployment options in Salto is actually to restore to a previous version. So let me go and click on here. And what this is going to do is it's going to take a look at all of the fetches. And again, those fetches are the polling in order to pull in the most recent configuration metadata coming from the environment. And it's going to create essentially a snapshot of the environment. That snapshot is going to show all the changes that are being made, and then you can use that to kind of revert back to in case anything happens. So especially helpful in the case that something was deleted directly from production. So if you go to create a deployment, it's going to show you a similar kind of element selection process that I showed you earlier, where it will show you all these different changes, then you can select which ones. The way that this works is that Salto is going to show you all the changes that we detect from that point in time to now, but then allow you to select which of those specific changes that you want to roll back to. So especially if you've made, let's say that you've made a number of changes, but then you need to revert that one change that you made to that automation, you can select that one, get that deployed. And then the great thing about that is that if you use that restore to a previous environment workflow in Salto, it's going to come up in the deployment history in Salto. So that way, again, you're just going to get full visibility into all the changes that are happening in the environment, who made the change, when the change was made, what the exact change was at the time. So getting you full visibility into the changes that are occurring there. All right, so I see there's a question in the chat. And sorry, Brian, I didn't see your second question right after your other one, but question about the JSU host function in the source system. If I use to push to production, what happens in the resulting workflows? Is the host function line removed or shown in the resulting system or shown in error? So Brian, if it's okay, I'd like to follow up. We'll make note of your question, and likely what's going to happen is it just won't show up in Salto because we don't have access to that from the current APIs, but we're pulling that information from Atlassian. But I have to take a closer look and just make sure I'm going to get you the right answer. All right, so one more poll. So that kind of completes the core part of the presentation about how to keep your sandbox in line with production. So I'd like to take a look at the other questions that we have. Also, I've put up a poll around just if you could also rate the session today and provide some feedback, where we did well, where we could do better, while I'm taking a look at some of these questions. All right, so one more question. Question from Denise: would Salto be able to export all the configuration and production sandbox to a document format to generate a design doc, for example? Great question, Denise. So the way that Salto is currently exporting this information is going to be in what we call these Knuckle files, and that's what we're viewing. Actually, if I come back to the Explore tab and look at the files, essentially Salto is turning all of the configurations into this flat file structure that you can use to explore what is currently set up in the environment. Now, if I take a look at, for example, this is what one of the files themselves look like. All of this can be exported to a Git repository, and that Git repository would be, one that you yourself own, your organization owns, so you can always use that information. Right now, we don't really have like a way to visualize this inside of Salto, but these files could potentially be used to create maybe a design doc, or they could be used to, understand a little bit more about the dependencies of all of the configurations. But yeah, you just need to export it to Git, and then you can do with those files, provide more analysis on top of the files, or create that design doc. And all right, so Brian got a question. I have a use case where I want to deploy a small change between systems. For example, create a field, add it to a couple of screens, create a script runner behavior to control that field, and a script to support that behavior. Can Salto deploy that isolated change without anything else? Yeah, great. That's a perfect question, Brian. So let me come back to show another type of deployment in Salto. This time I'm going to be going from my Sandbox environment to my production environment. I will call this new deployment. And this is showing me all the changes between Sandbox and production. Now, these are showing me all of the differences between the environments, but I don't have to deploy all these changes. So if you're talking about a change where you've created a new field, this creation of this new field would likely show up in the additions tab because it's a net new field. It hasn't been created in your target environment. And then you're mentioning that you're adding it to a couple of screens. You're creating a script runner behavior, to control that field, and a script to support that behavior. Those would likely show up under the modifications. So what you could do is actually under the additions tab, let me look at one of these fields. So this is an example of a new field that I added. Now I don't have any script runner behaviors that I can show being tied to this field, but if I select this field for deployment, you'll notice under the additional dependencies, it's going to flag anywhere where that field is being referenced. So that's where I could go into, here I see that the screen was modified, the issue layout was modified. So I also include these modifications as part of my deployment. Now, these are all additional or optional. It's not required to make these changes, but Salto is going to kind of call these out just in case you want to review these changes. That being said, the required dependencies are all of the changes that are, like the name suggests, required to make. You do need to make these changes in order to push that change over because of some necessary changes here. Now, under the additionals tab, under the additional dependencies, this is where we're going to show any of those optional changes that you don't necessarily need to make. So it's just a matter of selecting which ones that you need to make. But you can definitely select partial changes, not only within a configuration itself, like, for example, only add this field to this screen or so on, but you can also select only specific changes from the environment. So yes, short answer is yes, Salto supports deploying isolated changes without changing anything else. Now, I know this is a little different than other kind of migration tools work. I know some other migration tools usually work by migrating everything related to the configuration that you're choosing. Salto doesn't work like that. Salto only kind of requires those absolutely necessary elements to move over, and then everything else is, only what you select. And if anyone else has any questions, please feel free to drop into the chat or the Q&A. I'll be here until the end of the hour for any questions. If not, if you could take a look at the poll, we'd love to hear any feedback, what we did well, where we could do better. And like I mentioned at the beginning of the call, we will be following up with a recording of the webinar, as well as some more information about Salto, as well as some of the references to like blog posts and documentation to provide a little bit more context from the call. Oh, Brian, thanks for the feedback. Yeah, so this is that's like one tool, for example, that doesn't necessarily help with aligning because it can sometimes override everything. So again, Salto doesn't work like that. It only makes the changes that you select, while also flagging any absolutely required changes. Question from AJ: when will Knuckle swag be sent out to all the attendees? AJ, I can't answer that, but I will try to get you an answer. I should say I can't answer that today, but we will get you an answer. And for any of those that do drop, thank you again for joining. If you stick around, I'm here for more questions. If you do need to drop, please, we'd love to hear your feedback in the poll. But yes, yeah. So we will be at Teams 25, and we will have swag for that as well. For anyone that was at Teams 24, we had a booth and we had some Knuckle swag, some stickers and bags and so on. Oh, thanks for the feedback, AJ. And thank you again for everyone for attending. Again, I'm not going anywhere for the unless there's no questions. So if there's any more questions, please feel free to drop a question in the Q&A or the chat. And then for any of you that are dropping off, please take a look at the poll. We'd love to hear your feedback, what went well, where we could do better. And if there are no questions, I'll probably end in just a couple minutes. So one question, since backups are incremental, if I wanted to roll back the changes to a specific day, say 3 days ago, would I select that date of the backup, or do I need to select all the dates before that plus the date? Great question. So if I come back to the compare and deploy, let me just show you the way that this works. So the backups are showing a delta. However, we're showing the values at a specific time. So if you wanted to roll back a configuration to a specific date, you wouldn't need, like you mentioned 3 days ago, you would not need to select all of the dates before. You would just select that date, and then we would show you the changes as well as any dependencies. And one question, to use Salto, do I just install the add-on and then you can do backup? Yeah, so to get started with Salto, we will follow up with some more detailed documentation about how to get started with Salto. But for Jira Cloud, it's just a matter of setting up your Salto environment, connecting it, providing an API token to connect to the environment. If you're using Jira Data Center, it's a matter of installing the plugin. It's a very lightweight agent on the Jira DC instances where you're going to be connecting to, and then setting up the environment in Salto. But again, we're going to provide a little bit more details about how to actually get started with a Salto account and how to get connected to the Salto, how to connect your Salto environment to your Jira environments. And I think we're going to wrap it up in just about a minute. If there are some questions. Question from Satya: Jira Cloud. Okay, so you're using Jira Cloud, Satya. So you would just have to get started with Salto. There's nothing necessarily to install. Now, does Jira Cloud support TMP, team managed projects, and Jira product discovery? So team managed projects, no. Currently, no. So Salto just supports the company managed projects, primarily because I should say it's because of some of the limitations on the Atlassian APIs that are available to manage the team managed projects. So for now, Salto does not manage those. And Jira product discovery, Satya, let me take note of that and I'll follow up. I'm not sure off the top of my head. Okay, yeah, and Satya, thank you. We will follow up with a little bit more information for you once we confirm. All right, so I think we're going to end the webinar here soon. So if you haven't provided feedback in the poll, please, what we did well, what we could do better, and keep an eye out for the follow-up email with the recording to the webinar. And thanks again, everyone, for joining. It was had some great questions today, so I really appreciate the participation from everyone.